Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about a movie my wife and I watched last weekend. Alexander by Oliver Stone, the director's cut. Now, I didn't see this movie when it was in the theaters. It didn't look particularly good. I really wasn't believing Colin Farrell as Alexander, but I thought I'd pick it up cheap. I'll watch it and see what happens. Now, Alexander the Great was a man fully deserving of the term great. I firmly believe that he was the greatest leader in written history, both politically and militarily. And his tactics even had bearing on the 20th century because they actually function quite effectively as tank maneuvering. Imagining his units of men moving as a block, each being a tank unit. They still hold true. He was a genius. He used tactical and strategic advantage whenever he could. He engineered feats of military marvels wherever he went. He broke through old concepts in military tactics and came up with things that no one had ever seen before. He took on a force 5 times larger than his own and beat them. Why? Because he thought outside the box in a way that they simply were not prepared for. Everything he touched, as far as combat was concerned, turned to gold. The man was just incredible. And it goes without saying that I really enjoy reading, experiencing the life of Alexander the Great. Until I saw this movie. And somehow, Oliver Stone took this incredibly interesting man's life and made it some of the most boring drivel I have ever watched. I watched this entire movie, right up until the last horrible end. My wife was unaware of this film was done by Oliver Stone. And when the credits began to roll, she saw them. It said, directed by Oliver Stone. And she said, oh, that explains it. And that pretty much sums up this movie. It was just painful to watch. Now, there were a few good things. Angelina Jolie and Rosario Dawson were in this, and they were both very pleasant to look at, and I think they did their roles rather well. I enjoyed their accents. The most famous battle that Alexander ever fought against the Persian king Darius was fairly well done, but it was a little confusing. This film had some narration in points, kind of talking over the scenes. And I think that battle would have been a perfect place for it. Because even though I knew exactly what was going to happen, because I've studied that battle fairly deeply, even I was a little confused. It was kind of hard to figure out what was going on. And I can't imagine what someone who had no idea what that battle was going to entail must have thought. It must have just been chaos. But it was an incredible battle. It was an incredible victory. And it really showed the world that no one was ever going to stand in the way of Alexander. And no one did. He died at 32 and he died undefeated, and that's really rather impressive. And that being said, the only other thing I could think about this that was good was some of the costuming, both the just standard costumes worn by the actors, and the armor and weapons were fairly well done. And if you happen to like that sort of thing, there were a lot of really pretty men in this movie. I mean, really pretty men. Some of the men were as pretty as Rosario Dawson and Angelina Jolie. But other than that, this film didn't have much to recommend it. But there's one thing that really stood out for me. One thing amongst all the garbage I had to wade through to get to the end that was really the most glaring and horrible. And that was Colin Farrell's accent. I'm aware that Mr. Farrell was born in Ireland. But to the best of my recollection, Alexander the Great was not born in Ireland. And yet, for the entire film, Alexander the Great had an Irish accent. And it wasn't just him. A number of the supporting actors had Irish accents. The only thing I can think is that Oliver Stone threw the other guys in there in the hopes that people wouldn't notice that Colin Farrell had an Irish accent during the entire movie. I was stunned the first time he opened his mouth. I couldn't believe it. Now, I freely admit, I have no idea how hard it is to hide your accent. I'm sure I have one. I don't hear it. It's what I grew up with. I can recognize other accents fairly well. I've never tried to shake whatever I currently have, and adopt a different voice on a full-time basis. But then again, I'm not an actor. I don't want to be an actor. And I would think that part of being an actor is the ability to assume or to hide your own accent. And Colin Farrell failed at this spectacularly. So, I can't recommend this movie. But, to save this video from being a complete bummer, I am going to recommend The Generalship of Alexander the Great by J.F.C. Fuller. And this is a history and biography. It covers the life of Alexander the Great on a personal level, and it talks about every single one of his major battles in some wonderful detail. And this is a small book. It's, fairly decent sized. Incredibly good book. I loved every page in this thing. It made Alexander's life pop in a way that this film completely and utterly failed. And the amount of time it took me to read this seemed to fly by in comparison to the amount of time it took to watch this. So, don't see Alexander the movie. Do read the book I just referenced.